Hello and welcome to HR Voices, brought to you by BW People. HR Voices brings you the most insightful conversations with the national and international HR leaders and innovators in HR solutions. Before I introduce our guest for today's episode, here's a quick request to follow our LinkedIn page, bwpeople.in, and be a part of this fastest growing HR community in India. Our guest for today is Mr. Ayaskant Sarangi. Ayaskant is the Chief Human Resources Officer and a member of the Executive Council at Mphasis. With over 2 decades of experience in strategic HR, Ayaskant has led the HR function while managing workforce planning, talent acquisition, compensation and benefits, mergers and acquisitions, learning and development, and analytics. Before joining Mphasis, Ayaskant served as the CHRO of Wipro Enterprises and has also worked with the organizations such as GE, Mphasis Technologies, and L&T. Welcome on our show, Ayaskant.
Thank you so much, Bilquis, for inviting
It
me
is
over.
so good to see you. It's a privilege to have you with us today.
Thank you. Thank you so much for inviting me over.
We are discussing the role of HR today when it comes to creating culture in the organization and how the HR leaders can become, culture architects rather than policy enforcers. How do you see the role of HR has evolved from organizations function which enforces policies to a function which is creating culture, values, and behaviors in the organization?
No, wonderful question. And I think to begin with, I think the nuances around ensuring policies are in place would always continue because it will also have a tight linkage to the culture one is creating. But before that, I think one can't look at culture in isolation. In my view, it starts with appreciating what is the business strategy, right? And that is one important shift. And that's clearly getting expected by CEOs across the board. That does my HR guy really understand the business strategy? And therefore, what are the frameworks the person is going to put in place to kind of ensure that the strategy is furthered? And that's when coming up with frameworks which kind of enables the culture you are trying to create, which is nothing but what are the behaviors that you would like to encourage, either through your structure, either through your operating framework, either through your rewards, either through the way you communicate, to further that agenda of strategy is something that is clearly getting expected. In fact, towards that, one would end up creating policies for that matter, right? So, for example, if you're coming up with a sales incentive framework, that will also call for a policy because it has to drive a certain behavior to drive a specific outcome that the company is expecting, right? So, in nutshell, understanding business strategy and then linking it back to what are the HR frameworks that are required becomes an important expectation. The second important part here is in terms of how does one help enable the change that is expected? Because given the amount of change that is happening around us globally, I mean, there are multiple factors that are driving it. How does one keep an organization steady in such an environment, helps navigate through that journey across a multi-generational workforce becomes the other important expectation, right? So one is designing the expected behaviors, but the second important part is how does one help change that, right? And then all of this is done in partnership with the business teams. To give a very, very simple example, if you're expecting a certain behavior to be cascaded down the rank and file, you would expect the senior leadership to demonstrate that day in and out in their uh, the way they go about their respective jobs. And HR has to play a role in ensuring that each of the leaders in that ecosystem are demonstrating that behavior day in and out, right? So therefore, what it also means from an HR perspective, it's also about orchestration. So there is a design element that's there for cultural change in line with the strategy. There is a change element that is there that has to where everybody has to change to kind of further amplify the expected behaviors. And then there is an orchestration layer that is there in terms of how does one really put all these things together, seeing what the left hand does, what the right hand does, and driving it uniformly in a coherent fashion is the third important expectation. And that's how I see the role of HR really changing significantly. And it's going to even get more and more and more complex as the years go by from a future perspective.
Fantastic. That sets the tone of the conversation. I want to understand from you. You briefly spoke about business strategy, how business strategy is important when we are formulating the culture of the organization. How do you think the HR leaders can align the cultural initiatives with the vision, mission, and the business strategy of the organization? Can we focus more inside this particular aspect?
Right. So let me start by saying, how does one really build a strong business understanding? Right. I mean, that's the starting point, at least from my personal vantage point. I would say, you know, as elementary actions like participating in business reviews, interacting with your end customer, trying to understand what your competition is doing in that place, reading about what's happening in that specific industry. All those things act as strong input parameters. How is a deal won? How do I generate cash for my company? Right, so on and so forth. So spending time to understand that becomes critical. And then you also play a big role in helping understand what are the goals that we are trying to pursue as far as a specific area is concerned. Some of those mandates could even come from the board of the organization, right? And these are the goals that we want to drive as far as a specific area is concerned. So a sound understanding of that becomes a foundation. Then comes in the linkage in terms of what is it that I need to put in place from an HR perspective. To give us further simplified example, do I need to create a new org design, right? And therefore, do I need to hire a specific set of people, which is going to be helpful for me to kind of put that structure in place? Is there some training that is required to upskill my talent, keeping in mind the my future's journey from a growth perspective? What's the operating mechanism do I need to put in place? Because it's all about reviews, and that would be put in place. How would the decision making metrics work in the organization? Because as an organization, it's nothing but a group of people coming together, everybody working, everybody taking decisions. So how do decisions get taken in an organization, right? To enable again this growth, right? Who has a final accountability? And then how does one really inspire your rank and file of the organization to align with that goal? That's when elements like your how do I drive a right employee experience comes in. Since you touched on that, how do I bring in empathy in my day conversations with my teams? How do I communicate effectively so that they get inspired with the vision that has been laid out or the goal that has been set in place? So all these things really come in play, right? And that's how one fundamentally goes about linking it out. I mean, let me just find an example in terms of what is it that we are trying to do. Of course, we have defined um, a business strategy for us as an organization that we want to pursue over the next few years. But along with that, we have also defined our employee value proposition, um, which we have called out publicly as high tech, high touch, and high trust.
Okay.
Right? And if you go to our website, you'll see that. So first, that's the element that, hey, this is what we stand for, and this is what it means for every employee in the company. So when an employee asks, what is in it for me? You are walking into an environment which will be high tech, high touch, and high trust. High tech would be all about, am I working on my next gen tech areas and making a difference to my end clients, right? That's one perspective. Therefore, towards that, how am I really building my employee capability, right? And helping them to move up their own value chain as individuals from our own development perspective, right? That's the high tech part of it. Then there's high touch. How do I drive a hyper personalized experience for a global workforce, right? Including coming up with basic elements like how do I bring in technology into the day-to-day lives. For example, if I need to find out my leave balance, rather than talking to somebody, can I use an AI-enabled system which tells my leave balance and also educates me how can I plan my vacation better, right? That's one comes the high touch, which is more personalized. And while I gave the example of HR ops, the same can be equally done in hiring or in onboarding and just so many other areas, performance management, so on and other. The high touch part of it, high tech, high touch, and high trust. which means doing business the right way, that nobody has to watch their back. We'll do things the most ethical way, so on and so forth. So while we have defined the EVP bill case, it's also about measuring it, which means is it becoming a part of everybody's measurement from an appraisal or performance management perspective? Do I reward the behavior when somebody is demonstrating these? Do I discourage behavior which is not demonstrating it? Each of them have to be day in and out experienced. That's when a new employee who walks into the company would say, hey, when the company on its website is writing down that I'm high tech, high touch, and high trust, this is what it really means, right? So that's how we have, as an organization, kind of gone down this path, right? Where you kind of keep
Fantastic.
linking
Yeah.
back your business strategy to your outcomes that you want to drive as an HR function. And while I'm saying HR function, if you step back and look at it, as I said earlier, HR function will always be an orchestrator.
Mm.
The only HR person for an employee is the person's manager or the mentor, right? The network that the person has. The HR function is basically creating the ecosystem for everybody to kind of work in unison in that framework.
That's great to know. In fact, you have touched upon the parts which I wanted to ask you, but you've already answered, is about inclusion and empathy and employee experience right from the beginning to the end of the cycle that the employee has in the organization. I want to ask you now about technology, how technology is important and how HR is using technology for creating the desired organization culture.
I think tech in HR has really accelerated post COVID,
Yeah.
right? I think even before I get into tech, I think one of the things that COVID significantly underlined across the function, HR function, more so even in the business teams, is empathy. Right? People
Mm.
stood up for each other. Because that
Yes.
orientation was critical. Otherwise, all of us were kind of just going through our motions day in and out. Then the other thing that happened during COVID is the entire concept of distributed workforce. Then the concept of hybrid workforce came into being and significantly got accelerated in the last 3, 4, 5 years. And therefore, the reliance on tech has kind of increased. So where does one see tech playing a role? Right in terms of talent sourcing. Lots of good work is happening across. We're also partnering with quite a few companies in terms of how do we ensure that the candidate experience, who is still not an Emphasian, is good. The person feels welcomed when the person first sends his or her profile across to the company. Secondly, if the person selected into the organization, how can I give a great onboarding experience, especially when not everybody could be joining at a specific work location. And then when you're looking at processes like hiring or onboarding, um, while they are individual words, but for an employee or a prospect, there's a process and it cuts across few days. But therefore, it's about from an empathy perspective, it's about keeping the person posted. This is where you are in the process. This is where your resume is, or you can expect a laptop in 5 days, depending on uh, what one is doing. But the engagement with the employee from an experience perspective, that's getting accelerated through tech. In
Yes.
addition to that, the element of scale is getting built because the moment you start talking about tech, it can get cut across multiple geographies, time zones, so on and so forth. So hiring, onboarding is one big play. The second big play where we're seeing tremendous amount of tech is getting used, especially in my industry, is in training or developing of talent. Okay? And one is the platform which would give access. I think today the world has moved from access to really nudging me or educating me that what if I learn will add significant value to me personally. So, for example, if I'm a Java certified leader, the system would nudge me, hey, why don't you learn Python? Because there could be a
Yeah.
lot of projects coming up in Python 6 months down the line. It's in your interest. And by the way, these are the 5 things you must do to get certified, right? So that's when the personalized experience that comes in the space of learning, right? The third element where a lot of HR tech is getting used is the concept of appraisals or performance next. So, for example, how do I write uh, my achievements well? How can a leader evaluate me well, right? Even from a leader's perspective, how can I write a very, very effective appraisal where I sharply articulate achievements, I talk well about the strengths, I talk about the development needs, and drive more conversations between an employee and a manager. That's becoming significantly huge because at the end of the day, it's about people coming together and working. And people fundamentally come to work. How am I doing in my job? Am I in the right track or not? That's the third place where a lot of tech is getting used. Again, all of this which I'm talking about is something that we are doing as we speak as an organization. And last but not the least, HR ops, right? Which is more about, because that's where in many companies, especially for company of our size and scale, uh, which was earlier considered as a HR back office. Um, but that's the function that touches each and every employee day in and out across the length and breadth of the company. The basic questions: hey, what's happening to my transfer letter? What's happening to my leave? What's happening to my salaries? I mean, those can be seen as mundane, but they are not. For an employee, those things matter, right?
Very
And
important. Yeah.
that's where technology in our space is helping us a lot to kind of really provide a personalized experience to an individual. I mean, to further build on it, today we have enough HR analytics work being done because there's just so much of data in HR of saying, hey, these are the 4 or 5 policies which have been considered not relevant by employees, and here's the feedback on them, right? Or these are 2 or 3 policies that are going down well from an employee's perspective. That's rich data for me, right? That this is what the voice of an employee is all about, and that's what HR ops helps in, right? And so all of these, at the end of the day, right? If I step back and look at, be it your hiring system, your onboarding system, your training system, your experience system, these are all verticals. While they are relevant from an HR perspective, Bilkis, an employee doesn't see them as verticals. Employee wants to see them horizontally. What's happening to my hiring? What's happening to my onboarding? What's happening to my training, so on and so forth. So today, what we have done, we have also created a horizontal layer on top. So that for an employee, rather than worrying about moving across different buckets, well, the employee has a horizontal view of this is what's going to happen in my life, and this is what I'm going to experience, right? And that's all possible because of tech. Now, did we have it 2 years back? The answer is no, because it wasn't even available in the market. But a lot of things have changed over the last 2.5 years, and therefore the adoption of tech to drive employee experience is a must-have.
Fantastic. That was a very, very comprehensive and very, very knowledgeable explanation of technology in the, making how the culture is implemented in the organization. You briefly mentioned about the role of top management, and when we were talking about business strategy, how do you enable the managers and leaders to model and reinforce the organizational culture? So, what are the various ways in which you do it?
So great question. I think the tone obviously has to be set from the top, right? The CEO and the top leadership team, they must set, hey, this is what I'm expecting from an organization. These are the leadership principles and behaviors that we would encourage, and these are the set of leadership principles we will not encourage, right?
Absolutely.
I think defining that becomes very critical, which should be obviously in line with the business strategy that I talked about earlier. So, ensuring that those conversations happen often, including taking stock once every 6 months, 9 months in terms of where are we on our journey, becomes important. Right. Second is, how do I role model it? Right. So today, what at least in our parlance, we have defined what we call as emphasis leadership principles, which where we have articulated what are the leadership behaviors that we want each and every person of the company to demonstrate. So ensuring that uh, right from the top, everybody is walking that talk uh, becomes very, very important, right? Because while I can end up saying what I want to say, if people watch me demonstrating a behavior which is different from what I've said, the authenticity gets lost there to a large extent, right? So therefore, seeing the mirror for ourselves as a top leadership team, am I walking the talk when it comes to my leadership principles? And that frequent checkpoints is something that we do as an organization. And like I said, the tone for us gets set right from the top, right? And therefore it becomes that much more easier. Third is constant communication around it. Because for a company which is slightly larger, you'll end up having so many new people coming in, you'll have attrition that's happening. So there's always churn that's happening. So how does one keep ensuring that your induction framework, your town hall, whatever communication framework one has put in place, keeps reiterating that these are the acceptable expectations, becomes a third important area. And the fourth thing that we have done is when it comes to performance management, we have integrated all of these expectations in the measurement, which ensures that all the employee gets feedback on these leadership principles and where they stood in the last 12 months. Right? And when a person knows that this is what I'm going to get evaluated on, in addition to meeting the hard targets that are expected out of me, I'll tend to focus on those also. Right?
Yes.
So though that's the other big part that we have kind of put in place. And last but not the least, which we have done consciously, role modeling, which is more about when you see a certain behavior getting amplified. So, for example, somebody has come up with an outstanding text and said, talked about a high tech EVP. Am I rewarding that behavior? Am I amplifying that work to the broader organization? Am I putting that person or that team in a pedestal for doing, hey, great job done? Because then that inspires a lot of people. Hey, if I am able to come up with a solution or a tech framework which can help create an advantage for the company, there will be a significant growth for me individually, as an individual, or as a group of people, as a team. So that's the other part that we have constructed, like, consciously constructed, right? But stitching it all together, and then last but not the least, at a leadership level, at least meeting once a year and discussing this formally is something we have put in place, because that becomes important. Otherwise, one would end up taking a lot of actions, but it's also important to check progress. Right? And that is something, as a leadership team, we have put in place. So, hey, this is where we are in terms of the entire 9 yards when it comes to the expected changes from a culture or behavior perspective.
Fantastic. You briefly spoke about the changes after COVID that we have experienced, the hybrid and remote working arrangements that the organizations have. How do you include them in the culture? How do you make a cohesive, inclusive, and engaged, employee numbers with those hybrid and remotely working employees as well?
So, as an organization, at least in our vantage point, we have talked about a hybrid model, which means people have to come into work for at least some days in a week. And that is important for creativity, that's important for innovation, that's important for even disagreements. All those things are equally required and create for bonding, right? At the end of the day, people bond when they meet in person, right? Having said that, I also touched earlier upon the tech part of it.
Yeah.
So even if I'm miles away, tech ensures that I'm reached out on all these areas that are required, be it in terms of the way I work, be it in terms of the way I have questions for the organization and the way I grow myself, right? Tech plays a big part. Third thing we have done is, at the end of the day, from an employee's perspective, they rely a lot on what is it that they're hearing from their line managers, their mid managers, so on and so forth. So as we speak, we have undertaken a lot of developmental interventions for our first time managers, middle managers, in terms of how do you grow talent in a hybrid model. How do you bring them together? How do you motivate them? How do you rotate talent? How do you set goals and objectives? How do you inspire? So on and so forth. How do you delegate? Right? So systemic training programs, and again doing this very strategically, right? Quarter after quarter, quarter after quarter, which is such a consistent, repeatable process, given that the organization is changing rapidly. That plays an important part, right? Because for a hybrid employee to be successful, um, the manager has to be also working slightly differently than what
Absolutely.
traditionally the manager worked in the pre-COVID era. So, a lot of investments in building that manager capability is something that we are consciously doing.
Fantastic. We also see that there are multiple generations working in the single organization
Yes.
nowadays. How do you, especially Gen Z, there is a lot of talk about Gen Z and how it is, gelling or not gelling with different generations. How do you manage this multi-generational workforce? And do you think that cultures of organizations are affected by this multi-generational mix in the organization?
I won't say affected. I think everybody benefits because for me, when I'm looking at a concept like diversity, when in addition to race, religion, etc., it starts with diversity of thought,
Yeah,
right? So when you have a multi-generational workforce, it by design creates that diversity, which is great for every organization. So as long as, at least for us, and even from my vantage point, if I'm focusing on three areas: one, am I listening better
yeah,
to these different groups of people? Second, am I able to create a hyper personalized workforce? So, for example, um, the questions that I could have as an employee for somebody who is in his early 50s now could be very different from somebody who is just starting his or her career, right? So as long as there is a tech-based environment for me, which kind of caters to my need, and all at the same point in time caters to the need of somebody who's just starting from uh, campus as a engineering grad, I think it kind of ensures that the right set of balances are there, right? So first is listening. Second is the hyper-personalized workforce. Third, which is so critical, is team design.
yeah.
Yeah, because I mean, across the board, the concepts of hierarchies are getting challenged by concepts of networks, right? So, intentional designs of teams, which has representation from uh, various groups of people, and then intentional designing of the decision-making framework, which means because I'm the senior most HR guy, my decision cannot be always be right. And that appreciation at my end is critical for that campus recruit to feel comfortable that yes, I can, my idea would finally be accepted, even though uh, there's a gentleman in this room who has almost close to 30 years of experience, right? So that's the part of it, right? How do I create my team design thoughtfully, and how do I define my decision making, which is non-hierarchical in nature, which means the best idea wins and not the senior most person's idea wins. That is what has to be consciously done to kind of arrive at the right framework, right? And then last but not the least, I would say that the moment you get global, you are actually having people working across different time zones. I mean, that's the other part, right? One is the generational element to it, one there's a time element to it as well, right? And work is happening and there's a lot of dependencies on each other, right? So therefore, in that environment, um, how do people come together and work, right? What are acceptable norms? What are not acceptable norms? That definition is important.
Fantastic. That's really good to know. And my one last question, in fact, I want to know your message for the managers and leaders who are given this important task of creating and implementing the culture in the organization, how they can create a good culture in the organization by demonstrating strong values.
No, I would say, look, I mean, it's very difficult, right? Because at the end of the day, culture building is a journey.
Yeah.
It's not a one stop saying, hey, this is what I've done, and then that's it. Right. So, but I would say three or four things. One is how will I be listening to our teams? That's point number one. Point number two is how well are we having dialogues with our teams,
Yeah.
brainstorming more often with our teams to understand what's their point of view and also to articulate this is what is expected of them, right? Point number two. Point number three is a clear articulation of how your job is important to this team's outcome. A lot of us read about uh, you know people give their extra bit when they kind of have a strong linkage to the purpose that they're working towards to. Therefore, if I can articulate to my, assuming I have a 10-member team, that this is why your job is critical to this specific outcome, I'll be able to inspire that many number of people. And last but not the least, a very honest, consistent, transparent communication on where does the person stand, the good and the not so good, but doing it respectfully, uh, right? Nobody wants to be, shown a put down saying, hey, you do not know much about this ABCD, right? So how does one bring in that element of humility? How does one bring in that element of respect into a conversation? Is critical in today's day and age.
Your answers are very comprehensive, very insightful. It was lovely conversation today, and thank you so much for being with us today, Ayaskant. It was a pleasure to have you with us today.
Thank you so much, Bilquis, for inviting me over. I enjoyed as much. Thank you.
Thank you, and bye bye.